Without further ado, let's get back to Dr. McClelland and the interview. And it gets even better. What's it been like for you to live with this all these years? I mean, you get guys like me calling you all the time for interviews and
Well,
things
it's
of
not
that.
all the time. I do about it once a time. I've gotten used to it. It hasn't really affected my life.
Do you ever play those scenes over in your head over and over again?
Oh, no.
No way.
This isn't like something that happens like post-traumatic shock syndrome.
I see,
People
sir.
are,
Right.
it doesn't affect me. At least it didn't affect me that way. I mean, I don't mean to sound, callow and uncaring.
You don't.
I'm not saying that at all. It's just that when you do what I do, and that is I'm a surgeon, and I have ever since I began my surgery residency in 1957, one of my main jobs has been taking care of seriously injured patients. So this is not a once-in-a-lifetime sort of thing. This is an everyday event for me throughout my life, this sort of injury and treating this sort of injury of greater or lesser degree in all kinds of people. Now, granted, none of them are the President of the United States, and so I don't mean that doesn't have its, particular significance. But nevertheless, it's not as if I were just someone that this was the only trauma patient I ever treated. I've treated literally in my long life hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I would say up to thousands of patients with traumatic injuries. So I'm used to it, if you will.
As a doctor, sir, and for the students that are listening, what is it like when you lose a patient? Can you describe that experience for them?
Well, you mean when you first begin to learn how to operate and do things like this?
Yes, sir.
Oh, sure. Well, when you're first getting into this, you do. You're queasy at the stomach. Sometimes even people, I never have done this, fortunately, but people even faint and fall down, dead away in the operating room and have to be revived. But that very quickly goes away, and you soon become used to it and realize that you have to stay in there for the patient's sake. You can't be deferring to how do I feel about this. You have to put those things aside and keep your mind attending to the patient, not attending to your feelings or your thoughts.
Can we talk about Lee Harvey Oswald?
Well, again, I'll go back sort of to square one, how I first encountered that he was injured. This was, of course, on Sunday, 2 days after Friday, the second day after Friday. I was at home. It was, again, around noontime. My wife was upstairs getting dressed to go out to dinner with my mother and our 2 young children. And my mother was visiting from East Texas, and we were going to go out to lunch. And I was sitting downstairs waiting for them to get ready upstairs, and I thought, well, I'll turn on the television set in my living room and see what the news is, see what's going on in light of what had just transpired on Friday. So I turned the TV on, and as the picture was forming up, I could hear the sound even before the picture became apparent, and a voice was saying, he's been shot, and I thought, my goodness, what is this now? Then the picture formed, and I saw the famous scene that everyone's familiar with now, Oswald having just been shot by Ruby and had slumped to the ground, and this deputy sheriff in the big Stetson hat is bending down over him and looking to see what's happened. And so with that scene in mind, I stood up, walked to the foot of the stairway in my house, and called upstairs to my wife, and I said, I'll have to forget lunch. I have to go to Parkland. They've shot Oswald. And she called down and she said, who is Oswald? And I said, he's the man they say shot President Kennedy. They've shot him now. So I got in my car and headed for Parkland. And on the way there, I met Dr. Shires, who was now back in town from his meeting in Galveston on Friday. And in fact, he had arrived back Friday about 3 hours after the assassination had occurred, and got there in time to operate, along with me and Dr. Baxter, to explore Governor Connolly's leg wound. And so he had arrived back earlier than that. But anyway, I saw his car approaching me on the street going toward Parkland, and we stopped and stuck our heads out the window and asked each other, did we know what had just happened? and we each one had heard, I had seen it on TV, he had heard it in his car radio just then, and so we said, well, we better quickly get out to Parkland, and we did. He turned his car around, headed back to Parkland, and I followed him rapidly out there, and we got to Parkland and went into the emergency room just after Oswald had been received into trauma room 2 there in the emergency room and was being attended to by a crowd of residents who were intubating his trachea, connecting him to a respirator machine, pumping blood into him, and so on, getting him ready to go up to be operated on immediately. And so that's, after looking in there and seeing that they were doing that, Dr. Shires and I went upstairs to change quickly into scrub suits, and by the time we did that, Oswald had been taken upstairs and was lying on the operating room in the Parkland operating room. And from the time he was wounded, someone was looking at this, told us that it was just slightly over a half an hour from the time he was wounded until Dr. Shires had made the midline abdominal incision to explore his abdominal gunshot wound. So that was how quickly that came
Wow, that's really fast. What was your initial thought when you heard that he was shot?
Again, I don't go into, well, do I think this, do I think this happened? I just got up and said what I had to do, and I went out and got in my car and went out to Parkland.
Okay, fair enough. Afterwards, when you had time to reflect, did you think that it was strange that Oswald had been shot by Ruby?
Oh, yes, and not only that, but who shot him? And,
yeah.
Of course, since then, I've accumulated here, there, and yonder through the years a good deal of information, of, some good, some not so good, perhaps, that has colored my thinking along the way over the years as to what happened, and that there is a conspiracy rather than Oswald being a lone shooter.
So you do believe there was a conspiracy at this point?
Oh, I don't believe it. I'm essentially I'm not certain of anything, even to the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you.
Okay, sir.
But I'm reasonably comfortable in my own mind that there was a conspiracy, and if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on that, I can
yes, sir.
Enlarge on that shortly. Maybe not right this moment, but when we finish, what we're talking about with Oswald.
Okay, that'd be fine. Is there anything you would like to add about what happened with Oswald? Was Marina there?
Was who?
Marina?
His wife?
Yeah, his wife, I'm sorry.
I have no knowledge of where she was or what she was doing at that time. I heard later some various things about where she was, but I have no knowledge of that any more than any other person, from anywhere else.
Now, apparently Dr. Crenshaw received a phone call from a very important person from the White House. I was wondering if you had any inside knowledge about that.
Well, Dr. Crenshaw wrote a book,
Yeah.
that was of rather suspicious authority. And he claimed he had done, I hate to speak ill of the dead, he's dead now. But Chuck had sort of a vivid imagination. And first of all, nobody would be calling a senior surgery resident for information. I don't think anybody would do that.
Okay.
There was a call, we understand, that came through from the White House, and I think I have from other sources. In fact, one of the neurosurgery residents told me this, who was sitting in the nurses' station and heard a call come through to the nursing station in the operating room as Oswald was being operated on, that ostensibly was from the White House. But it didn't come through to Dr. Crenshaw. It just came through to the operating room, and somebody wanted to know how Oswald was doing.
I see. So any speculation of who that may have been?
Well, no one knows.
Okay.
They just, in fact, no one is absolutely sure that this was a call from the White House.
Okay, understood, sir. I would like to try and bring the essence of what was taking place in that era right to the forefront and bring it right into and present it to the students that are listening. And I was wondering if you can just tell us your own political views at that time and your own personal views on JFK at that time.
Okay, well, I would say I was a middle-of-the-roader. I've tried to always, maybe inappropriately, straddle the fence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a political person. I just do what I do, my job, and try to do the best with that, and hope that we're being led by good leaders. I think everybody in the country, even the middle of the roaders, as I considered myself to be, had reservations, as we do about all presidents, as we do about our current president, wishing him well and hoping that he does a good job, but not being sure that some of the things that he's doing are good. I think everybody was very pleased with his handling of the missile crisis in October, of the 61.
Can you tell us what that was like for you? Because you were how old were you at the time, 29?
No, the assassination occurred 2 days after my 34th birthday.
34, so you're still a young man.
It's my second year on the faculty at Southwestern Medical School when the assassination occurred.
You had a family at the time?
In 1961,
yes,
when the missile crisis occurred, I was a senior resident finishing my training at Parkland Hospital.
And you had a family, and I was going to ask you what it was like.
I had a family, had a wife, and my son was 2 years old, and we lived there in Dallas, and so we were worried, like everybody else in the country, were we about to be hit by a nuclear bomb. What
was that like? I just want to try and get that across to the students.
Well, it was very frightening, and people were talking about digging shelters in their backyard, and in fact, I don't know, we were even looking out in our backyard at the time, wondering where we might put something like that. So people were very concerned about this.
Very terrifying.
We were very gratified when we saw on television those Russian naval ships turning around and going back to Russia.
Absolutely.
After a deal had been made by between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Dallas in general, at that time, just to complete the answer, whereas I said I was the middle of the roader, Dallas in general was a different town from what it is now. It was, first of all, there 46 years ago, it was a very provincial place and a much smaller place. Now the population is many, many times larger, probably 5 to 6 times larger, 5 or 6 million rather than just a million. It was very insular. Most of the people who lived here were from this part of the country. And not that many people who had come here from all over the world, and that's not true anymore at all. It's a very metropolitan city now, and has been for many years, but it was very insular and provincial then. And I would say that the main thrust of the political feeling here was far right wing. At least they were the most vocal of all the political voices in Dallas. And in fact, the day before the assassination, which I think speaks to terrible things about Dallas, in one of the Dallas papers, the Dallas News or the Times Herald, I can't remember which, there was a full-page ad that some group had taken out, so one of these far right-wing groups, whether it was the John Birch Society, I don't know, but one of them had taken out a full-page ad accusing President Kennedy of high treason and going into all the list of why they thought he should be tried for high treason. And so that was the climate that they were coming into. And just the month before that, Adlai Stevenson had been here as a potential presidential candidate, and one of the ladies, who was a member of one of these right-wing organizations, hit Adlai Stevenson over the head with a sign she was carrying, and that made the news there a month before the assassination. So that was the political climate here, and Dallas was very quickly, the day of the assassination and thereafter, branded with the name the City of Hate.
Oh, man.
That's what we had to live. We had to live that down over many years.
Going post-assassination now, the Warren Commission testimony, were you satisfied with the way that was conducted and the way your testimony was presented? Was it accurate?
Well, my testimony was accurate, but I think the Warren Commission, over these long years of reading and looking at various other sources of information and whatnot, not necessarily what I thought at the time, because I think what I thought at the time was not really what I think now is based on, and is really not apropos what I thought at the time about the Warren Commission. I guess what I thought at the time is, well, they've investigated this and concluded that Oswald was the only shooter. But even then, I thought, I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion. But as far as my own testimony, I gave my testimony not in Washington, but here in Dallas to subsequently Senator,
Arlen Specter.
Arlen Specter came here, and he was just, nobody knew who he was. He was a 32-year-old investigator, at a low level for the Warren Commission, and he was assigned to take the testimony of various people who were connected with the assassination in any way. And so I gave him testimony there in the Parkland administrator's office over a period of about 30 minutes. He asked me various questions, various matters, straightforward, just simply the facts, ma'am, as Sergeant Friday used to say on Dragnet,
Dragnet, yeah.
No, he didn't ask me, well, what did I think about this, that, or the other. He just wanted to know what happened, what did I do, tell me what you saw, this sort of thing. Didn't ask my opinion on anything.
Were you ever presented with the autopsy photos, and were there any discrepancies?
Yes, they did. In 1988, they flew several of us to Washington. We landed at the National Airport, and we went immediately out to the National Archives building in Washington, and we were shown, each one in turn, about 5 of us who had been in the trauma room 1, 8 by 10 glossy pictures of the president's autopsy wounds, and asked if that's what we had seen in Dallas. And pretty generally, we told them that, yes, that's what we saw. And the only exception that I had was that they showed me one picture where apparently there was no wound in the right back part of his head, but I assumed it was because the anatomical prosector, the pathologist, had pulled a flap of scalp, which had been loose, up over that opening. And so I told them, I said, that's, I guess that's a flap of scalp up over the wound. Well, someone, I can't remember who, said, no, that's not a flap of scalp. That's just where the scalp was. I said, no, that's not. That's where there was a massive hole in the back of his head that was at least 5 inches in diameter. And I looked into it from about 18 inches as I held that retractor over a period of about 10 or 12 or more minutes while the tracheostomy was completed. I had a vivid and a close look and still have in my memory what that wound in the right back of his, extreme back of his head looked like. And that's a flap of scalp. Someone later told me, and I can't remember when or where or who, that, well, yes, this was, as a matter of fact, you're right, that was a flap of scalp.
I was going to ask you any speculation why they would try to cover that hole in the back of his head.
I have no idea whether they were trying to do that, whether they are, but there was that kind of sort of, I'm not sure what that meant,
Okay, understood.
And of course, there have been people who have tried to say that the president arrived in Washington wrapped in a different fashion than where he left Dallas, and in a different kind of container, different kind of coffin, and that maybe that attempts were made to alter the wounds. Some people have even said, oh, that tracheostomy has been altered. It's too big a wound. Well, I can speak for that. No, it had not been altered. That's exactly the way it was made at Parkland. It's just that people expected it to be smaller, and some people expected it to be in a vertical rather than a transverse direction. But that wound was not altered, as some people contended that it was.
Have you ever talked with Dr. Cyril Wecht over the years?
I've heard him speak many times on television, but I've never spoken with him myself.
I see. So he's never contacted you or anything to talk with you or anything of that nature? How do you feel about what he says? Well,
I can't even remember now all the things he said. I think he thinks that there was a conspiracy, but I couldn't tell you he said this, he said that. I really don't know.
Okay, shot from the front.
That much attention. I know he talked about the magic bullet and things, and I have no idea about that. I had no contact with that at all.
Okay, fair enough.
The bullet that was found lying on the stretcher and that sort of thing.
With all the mystery surrounding the wounds of the body. Do you think there could be a case made to exhume the body of the president?
I don't think so, no.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
You're listening to CKLU Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. I'm going to continue with Dr. Robert McClelland and his interview because we are definitely running out of time here, folks. So, just to let you know, Dr. Robert McClelland was the surgeon in Trauma Room 1 that day that was working on John F. Kennedy, a wounded John F. Kennedy, and also later on, a couple of days later, when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby, he worked on him also. So here we go.
I'll tell you what I think happened, and this is just this is my worm's eye view.
That's fine, sir.
After all these years, what I have put together, and I sometimes remind myself that sometimes you can put 2 and 2 together and come up with either 4 or 22. Your intentions are.
That's terrific.
I'm not saying, oh, I know this is what happened. Oh, yeah, this is what. I'm just saying this is a possible scenario. That's
Fair
all.
enough.
I don't pretend to have any kind of expertise that you got to listen to what I'm saying.
Okay.
I don't think that at all. But what I've kind of put together in my own mind, take it or leave it, is that from this long distance, putting together what I saw with it first, and over the years what I've learned, and sources that I've seen, and particularly seeing the Zapruder film for the first time about 11 years after the fact, that was an interesting piece of information that added to my thinking about what happened. But what I think happened is that if you look, in fact, I'll refer to the Zapruder film. And when I first saw that, was on the Johnny Carson show.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was about 11 years. Someone told me after the assassination that Geraldo Rivera was a guest on Johnny Carson's show, and he had acquired a copy of the Zapruder film. And so he was going to show that on the Carson show. And so I got a look for the first time of the actual assassination according to the Zapruder film. And of course, some people contend that that's been doctored. I don't know about that, but I doubt that it was. But there are people, been 2,500 plus books written, with various ideas put forward about everything here.
I don't think it was doctored either, sir, to be honest with you.
I don't think it was doctored.
Yeah.
I think it was, in fact, I'll tell you about my connection with Mr. Zapruder other than that in a moment.
Sure.
I had a personal connection later with him. Anyway, what I think happened on that day, and putting that together with the Zapruder film particularly, is that when you see the president in the motorcade, and they are riding down Elm Street, just heading toward the triple underpass. They're about to go behind a large sign there on the edge of Elm Street.
Mm-hmm.
And before the motorcade disappears behind that sign, Kennedy is first hit by a bullet. And the bullet that hits him apparently injures his neck because his both hands suddenly are jerked up to his neck. You may remember that from your visions of your viewings of the Zapruder film. Do you remember that?
Absolutely, sir.
And both hands go up to his neck, and that's just before he disappears behind that sign.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few seconds later, the motorcade and his car, the president's car, comes out from behind where it was being obscured by that sign. And all of a sudden, a second or two after he becomes visible again, his head explodes, and he is hit by the bullet that killed him in the head.
Right. That's right.
And he is thrown violently backward and to the left, as if a bullet had been fired from the front,
mm-hmm.
and slightly to the side, where it would have thrown him from from his opposite side, would have thrown him violently backward and to the left, and blowing brains and tissue out the top of his head and out the back of the car. And the motorcycle cop riding along beside it indicates that same impression.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, a lot of people heard gunshot reports from the picket fence and the Grassy Knoll. And, in fact, in a recent book that came out last October by a guy named Waldron called Legacy of Secrecy.
That's right. He's been on our show, sir.
There are some statements in there. This is based on material that was released from the National Archives fairly recently, FBI and CIA records. Anyway, one of the records was describing what Kenny O'Donnell, one of the president's closest friends and associates back from college days, who was there. In fact, I saw him in the emergency room that day. He was riding in the limousine right behind the president with a friend, and they heard shots coming from the picket fence, and they point that out in that statement in that book. And, of course, you can see people in the Zapruder film running up that Grassy Knoll, a large crowd of people. So I think that's where the shot was fired. And then there was further evidence of that I've recently become reacquainted with, that I heard something about at the time of the assassination, but that I heard about last year directly from the man involved, Mr. Ed Hoffman, at the meeting of the Lancer Society here in Dallas last year, where I ate at the Lancer banquet with Mr. Hoffman and his wife and their daughter, and two the authors of a book on what Mr. Hoffman saw behind the picket fence the day of the assassination. And you know probably about that Mr. Hoffman is a deaf mute, and thereby hangs the problematic part of this tale. He and his wife are both deaf mutes, and he was going to his dentist out at Arlington. At the time, the motorcade was coming under the triple underpass, or about to, and the police were stopping traffic along Stemmons Expressway there by the motorcade where it's coming through. And they stopped him and pulled him off to the side of Stemmons, and Mr. Hoffman got out of his car, and he was about probably 600 feet where he could easily see the back of the picket fence. And he saw three men there, and he's never gotten anybody to believe this, because nobody believes his story, because they say it varies too much. And they just kind of think he's kind of stupid because he's a deaf mute and not reliable.
That's silly.
Well, after meeting him there and talking with him and talking with these two men who wrote this book about him called From Behind the Picket Fence, I think is the title of it, and talking to Mr. Hoffman and his wife and his daughter interpreted for us, I'm convinced that what he saw, this is from a very intelligent man, even though he's a deaf mute, who saw what he saw and tried to report what he saw. He even wrote a letter to Ted Kennedy, who chose to ignore his communication to him. But he saw three men there. He saw a man in a business suit and hat, who was the central figure standing behind the picket fence. There was a man in some work coveralls to his right, the right of that man in the business suit behind the picket fence. And there was a man in a policeman's uniform standing to the man in the business suit's left behind the picket fence. And as Mr. Hoffman got out of his car and looked out over the scene there, he saw those three men. And just as he stood there, the man in the business suit lifted a rifle up that he had been holding in front of him, put it on top of the picket fence, and fired a shot, which, of course, Mr. Hoffman couldn't hear, but he saw a little puff of smoke. And then he saw the president's motorcade go by and saw that the president had been wounded. Well, he said the man then promptly, after firing the shot, loped over to the right to the man in the coveralls, threw the rifle across to him underhandedly, and the man took the rifle and broke it down and put it into the tool bag he was carrying, and sort of nonchalantly, after zipping the bag up, strolled off down the railroad track as if he was a railroad worker, and disappeared. And then the man in the business suit, accompanied by the policeman, walked out from behind the picket fence and out into the crowd that was accumulating, and disappeared also. That's what Mr. Hoffman saw, and has never been able to convince anybody about this. It's interesting that Thanksgiving, he was at a family celebration out in Garland, Texas, of Thanksgiving, and his uncle was on the police force at that time and was a police lieutenant, and he told him this story, and the police lieutenant was very alarmed when he heard this from his nephew, he was about 31 or 32 then, Mr. Hoffman was. And his uncle, he said, "Ed, you keep your mouth shut about that or you're likely to get killed. You don't tell anybody about that." This is what the police lieutenant said. Now, that goes along with stories that I have heard, totally apocryphal, about there were rogue elements of the police force here that may or may not, that's very iffy, have been peripherally involved in this whole scene. Whether this man was or not, I don't know. But that's how he responded to Mr. Hoffman's description of what he had seen behind the picket fence. So,
Any other? Yes, sir.
Another interesting story based on, I'm sure you've seen Nigel Turner's The Men Who Killed Kennedy, that British television thing.
Yes, sir.
And if you'll recall, in one of those, there was a soldier who was sitting on the grassy knoll who testified, and he felt the bullet go by his ear, he said. You remember that?
Yeah, that's Mr. Newman, is it?
I can't remember the soldier's name.
Oh, I know who you mean. Yes, I forget his name too now. Yes.
He was up there on the grassy knoll, and he said, "I felt the bullet go by my ear."
That's right.
So there's all sorts of direct and indirect evidence that the bullet that killed the president, blew his head up, and threw him backwards violently and to the left, came from the grassy knoll and from behind the picket fence. I'm convinced in my own mind that that's what happened. Now, having said that, I think Oswald shot him, but he fired the bullet. He fired the bullet from in my scenario here, he fired the first bullet that hit him, that made him put his hands up to his neck. I think his bullet that Oswald fired from the 6th floor of the book depository hit him in the back, hit Kennedy in the back. And in fact, there was a wound in the back that we didn't see, but the next day, Dr. Perry and I were sitting in our mutual office, and Dr. Perry got a call from one of the pathologists at the Naval Hospital, and they had just finished the autopsy, and I heard them ask, and I could tell what they were asking, and Malcolm Perry confirmed this to me right after he hung up, that they asked Dr. Perry, had we seen the wound in the president's back? And Dr. Perry said, no, we hadn't seen it because after he died, we didn't examine him any further. We didn't turn him over and look him over. We didn't feel that was appropriate. So, no, we did not see that wound. He said, well, there was a wound in the upper portion of his back. Well, what I think happened is that Oswald, and I think Oswald was he was a patsy. He was to distract attention from these real, what I think were mafia-hired assassins behind the picket fence. That's who they were. They were hired by the mafia and brought into this country from outside the country. They were members, from what Nigel Turner says, probably of the Corsican mafia, hired through the Marseille mafia. Brought into this country, as I understand it from Nigel Turner's television series, and I may be misremembering this, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that those assassins from Corsica, 3 of them, these 3 men behind the picket fence, were flown into Mexico City from Marseille in France.
That's right.
And then drove across the border up to Dallas from Mexico, where they stayed overnight in a house in Oak Cliff. And then the next day came out, set up behind the picket fence, and fired the fatal bullet. Then they flew to Montreal the next day, and from there back to Marseille and back to Corsica.
That's right. And, sir, guess where I hail from originally? Montreal.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I have a map, which I'd be happy to send you, of where Oswald was actually seen in Montreal the summer of 1963. 5 years later, Martin Luther King's assassin was also seen there several times in Montreal, James Earl Ray.
James Earl Ray, yeah.
Yeah, and just up the street is a place called the Allen Memorial Psychiatric Hospital, where in the late 50s, early 60s, the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control experiments took place. So Montreal's got quite an electric history.
Yeah. Well, it's a central area, I guess. And,
yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. And like I said, I keep acquiring bits of information. And then I mentioned what my thoughts, again, about the wound, the back of the head. I remember thinking at that time, although I thought initially that maybe it was that wound that turns out was not in the left temple, I thought, well, the bullet went in the left temple there the very day of the assassination and blew out the back of his head. But that struck me right then and there, not to speak of when I saw the Zapruder film, that was an exit wound, that huge wound in the back of his head. That was an exit wound. That wasn't an entrance wound. My personal observation of that.
You had mentioned the JFK Lancer lecture series that they give every year down in Dallas.
Right.
One of the sisters, Sherry Feaster, is a CSI, a senior crime scene investigator. She has done extensive work. She was on our show last year when we did a series on the JFK assassination. And she's Deborah Conway's sister, by the way. She's done incredible work using technology and science that she's used for the past 20 years to put criminals behind bars to examine the blood spatter on the Zapruder film. And she has also found a frontal shot, but with a distinct difference. She believes it came from the opposite side of Dealey Plaza.
Well, I would not agree with that.
Okay, fair enough.
That's the case.
Fair enough, sir.
I think it came from the front because of the way his body was thrown violently backward and to the left. That's what you would expect. I'm from East Texas, where there's a lot of deer hunting goes on, and I know kind of which way bodies go when they're hit. And there was that absurd thing that some urologists did with melons and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Latham, about how the jet effect of the brain caused the backward motion of the body. Or some people have said, no, that's just neurological spasms. No, I'm sorry. That was a bullet carrying a body backward violently and to the left, fired from the front.
One thing I'd like to ask you, and this has always been in my mind, I believe that the shot did indeed come from the front, but I always thought perhaps there might have been a possibility that he was hit by behind, but because of his back brace, that would prevent him from going forward and indeed would throw him backwards. Do you think there's any credibility to that?
No.
Thank you.
Because the back brace was, I didn't see it, they'd cut him out of it, but it was a low one. It wouldn't have prevented that.
Any other thoughts on the assassination?
Well, yes. Again, the latest piece of information that has partly come out of that book, Legacy of Secrecy,
Lamar Waldron,
other sources too, is the origin of this plot. Where did it come from, and why was the initial report by the Warren Committee accepted by Robert Kennedy and by the family as being okay, that they didn't say, well, let's push that investigation farther? Well, there's some thoughts in that book that are expressed, and some people in emails who told me about this book expressed them, that there was something else going on at that time in our national activity. And one was that Robert Kennedy was in some way involved in an ongoing potential possible coup d'etat in Cuba that involved maybe the head of the Cuban army taking over from Castro and his brother and getting rid of Castro, and that we were making a deal to set this up, and that somehow maybe the mafia, as they often get involved in these plots like that, might be involved or might know about it. So that when the assassination occurred, this potential coup d'etat that Robert Kennedy knew about and the people around him, they didn't want to put a monkey wrench into that in any way. So even though they didn't like it, they didn't press going beyond what the Warren Commission did. And I think later, even in fact just before he died, there was an article in the paper here by President Ford, just before he died, noting that there were many holes in his experience as the youngest member of the Warren Commission, that there were many holes in the Warren Commission conclusions, and that they were just basically trying to kick sand over what was going on there and get it out of the public's mind.
Just get it behind the... Don't forget, as we mentioned before, you had just gone through the Cuban Missile and potential nuclear holocaust, so the government couldn't take that chance again, and it makes perfect sense to me.
And so they didn't push that investigation any farther, and they just let it go, even though they say that they're pretty sure that Robert Kennedy knew that it was the mafia, namely Carlos Marcello, who was the head of the mafia in New Orleans, by the way, and also oversaw the mafia all across the South. Particularly, case in point, Joe Campisi at Campisi's Italian restaurant here on Mockingbird, just about 3 or 4 blocks up from my house, which was sort of the Bada Bing Club, if you recall the Soprano series.
Sure do.
Campisi's restaurant was kind of the Bada Bing Club for the local mafia. And Joe Campisi, who is now dead, he was the head of the local mafia. And years ago, I'm one of my favorite eating places is Joe Campisi's. I went into Campisi's restaurant, and they always had a lot of pictures, as a lot of Italian restaurants, posted around of this, that, and the other. And I found, to my surprise, years ago in there, that there was, well, this wasn't too many years ago, it was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, there was a little newspaper clipping pinned to the wall, and the newspaper clipping was a brief description and a brief story appended to a picture of Joe Campisi's back as he was going into a jail cell to visit, guess who, Jack Ruby.
Oh.
That picture was posted in Joe Campisi's restaurant. I thought, well, goodness, why would they do that?
Holy
Well,
cow.
first of all, Joe Campisi was already dead himself at that time. And so just real recently, about 3 months ago, I was eating in Campisi's restaurant again with one of my cousins from East Texas, and I was telling him this story, and I said, they later took that down, but I said, who knows, it might be back up. And I walked over to look around and see what was posted on the wall. And indeed, that picture was gone. But now they have a whole exhibit, which is on a bulletin board back by the kitchen, about a 2x4 bulletin board with the covers of several books implicating the mafia in the Kennedy assassination.
Wow, that's
there
explosive.
There in Campisi's restaurant.
Montreal in Canada is the head of organized crime. That's the main city for organized crime. That's where most of the dope comes in from abroad, right through Montreal, because of the extensive wharfs, and that's where all the ships land with their containers and stuff.
Central area, yeah.
So, this mafia connection, I think there could be something there, absolutely.
Oh, I'm convinced there is. In fact, I've got another thing to tell you.
Sure.
Aside from that Campisi thing, which I think is very significant, a personal, much later connection, and their exhibit as if they're proud of their connection, And Joe Campisi was working directly under Carlos Marcello at that time. Well, Carlos Marcello was after Robert Kennedy, who was after the mafia.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, Marcello got sent up to prison. And in this book, Legacy of Secrecy, when he was in prison, the FBI had an informant that they arranged to be his cellmate. And he recorded Carlos Marcello's rather prideful boasting about how he had set this whole assassination plot up, that he was the head guy. And this guy recorded it. Now, they claim in this book, as I recall, that they have just not released that recording, which they contended, I think, in this book. I haven't read the book that closely, but I just sort of skimmed through it when I bought it, that that recording is still in the hands of the FBI.
Whoa.
And so, anyway, there's that piece of information. And added to that, just recently, in regards of Carlos Marcello's involvement, along with these things I've just brought up, I was at a neighbor's house in my, about 2 blocks down from my house. And one day I was taking my walk in the neighborhood, and one of my neighbors that I'd known there for many years saw me, and he walked across the street from his house, and he said, "Oh, Dr. McClelland," he said, "could I ask a favor of you sometime?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, he said, "there's several of my neighbors that would really like to hear your story of your involvement in the assassination. Would you mind coming to my house next week and doing that?" And I said, "No, I'll be glad to do that." So the following Wednesday, I went down to his house, and I gave my little talk about this to a group of about 25 people from his neighborhood. And as I got through, several of them came up, and 1 or 2 asked questions, and the very last one to come up came up rather deferentially and introduced himself. And he said, I've got a kind of an interesting thing that happened to me along these lines of what you've been talking about. And I said, "Oh, well, I'm always glad to hear, different things." And he said, a good many years ago, he said, my wife and I were at a cocktail party. And we were standing talking to Nellie and John Connolly.
Oh.
And and I'll tell you who this was in a minute who was talking to me that way.
Mm-hmm.
We were standing there talking, a little group like you do at a cocktail party, and we were listening to John Connolly. And as we stood there and talked, Nellie had left our little group and went across the room, was talking to another little group of people across the room for a few minutes, and then she left them and came back to our little group. And she said, John stopped what he was saying to us and leaned down to Nellie and said, "Nellie, do you know who that was you were talking to?" And she said, "No, I don't know." And she said, John Connolly said to Nellie, "That was Carlos Marcello, the man who nearly got me killed."
Oh.
How about that?
Oh, my God. That's explosive, sir.
That's from the horse's mouth. And that person who said that to me was, I'm a little bit hesitant, he was one of the Hunt brothers, Hunt oil people.
Close enough for rock and roll. Okay. But we all know who they are. That's for sure.
Yeah.
That's incredible, sir.
Yeah.
Wow. Any other thoughts?
Another piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Well, I've had some interesting coincidences. I don't know if you're into Jungian synchronicity or not.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, the first one was this. About in October, 2 years before the assassination in November, when I was finishing up, in fact, the month of the missile crisis, I was a surgery resident still, and my wife, who is a nurse, was working across town at Baylor Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people she was taking care of there was Mr. Sam Rayburn.
Yes.
Mr. Rayburn, you probably recall who he was. He was the Speaker of the House forever in Washington.
That's right.
And he was a potent, maybe the most political figure, even over and above the president in many ways, at that time. And anyway, he had become ill, and it turns out he had a pancreatic cancer and was being taken care of here in Dallas, since he was a Texan, at Baylor Hospital. While he was there, he also had a stroke. Well, my wife was one of the nurses on his floor helping take care of him. And she called me up one day and said, "I forgot to pick up my paycheck at Baylor, and on your way home," and I never went to Baylor Hospital usually, "would you stop there and pick up my check?" And I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to." So I left work a little early and drove over to Baylor Hospital, where I never went. This was very unusual. And got out of my car, was walking across the street in front of Baylor, and I looked to my left, and there coming down at me was 3 or 4 motorcycle cops heading up a procession of 3 long black limousines. At that time, there was a side street, which is no longer there at Baylor, and I got to that side street entrance at Baylor about the same time the motorcycle cops and the lead limousine arrived at that side entrance. And we both all stopped there at the side entrance at the same time. I was standing by the rear door of the lead limousine, not close enough to it that one of the cops who had gotten off of his motorcycle came back down and gently and politely asked me to step back out of the way so he could open the rear door of the limousine for the occupant of the limousine. And as he did that and opened the door, and I was standing where I could touch the person who got out of the limousine from where I was standing, I just stepped back a little bit. Out stepped John F. Kennedy.
Huh.
I could have leaned over and patted him on the back. And he rapidly strode up the steps into the hospital and disappeared. He had flown to Dallas specially to see Mr. Sam Rayburn.
Wow.
Because of his political clout.
And there he was right in front of you.
And I just happened to be there. And what are the odds that the man who was one of the people that was helping take care of him through 2 years later would have been standing there close enough to touch him?
Astronomical.
Who never went to that part of Dallas ever, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first of the kind of how about that sort of things. And then go forward a little bit. You know, I said I had seen the Zapruder film. Well, one day, much later than that, but a few years around the time I first saw the Zapruder film, I still had a fairly busy private practice, and I operated not only at Parkland but also at Presbyterian Hospital across town on private patients. And I got a phone call one day from a friend of mine who's a surgeon at Presbyterian, and he said, I operated on a man today for gastric cancer, and he's not doing real well, and I think he's got some problems that I need to re-explore him for. And he said, I wanted to find out if you were going to be at Presbyterian this afternoon, would you mind scrubbing with me on him? And I said, no, I don't mind at all. I'll help you with that. So I got over there about 4 or 5 that afternoon. I walked into the Presbyterian operating room, and I asked the operating room nurse there in charge of the desk, I said, what room are we operating in, Jane? In fact, she had been a nurse at Parkland, was now in charge of the operating room at Presbyterian. I said, what room are we in? And she said, I think you're in room 5. And so I walked back and looked to see who the name of the patient was, to be sure that's where we were in room 5. And the name of the patient that was posted in room 5 that I was going to help operate on was Mr. A. Zapruder.
Oh, gee whiz.
And I helped operate on the man, not only helped operate on Kennedy, Oswald, and Connolly, but also on Mr. Zapruder, who took the assassination film.
Living history. You see that, folks? Right here, Dr. Robert McClelland. That's an incredible, incredible saga, my friend. Who would have ever thought that all those connecting dots would actually come together, circled around you?
Again, I think the chances of that are a little short of astronomical.
Absolutely.
And then that day that I went to the National Archives to see the pictures of the assassination, I got into the National Airport, collected my bag, went out to get a cab to go to my hotel. And I got into the rear door of the cab, who took my bag, put it in the back. I got into the back of the cab, and this was in 1988. At the time, the Democratic Convention was just starting. And guess who was delivering the opening address at the Democratic Convention that the cab driver had on the radio? As I got into the cab, it was John F. Kennedy, Jr., talking at the National Convention.
Oh, my goodness.
And I listened to him speak on the way into the hotel.
In subsequent years after the assassination, sir, did any of the Kennedy family or anybody associated with them ever try to contact you for further information?
No, not me. I think they know what happened.
I think so, too, to be honest with you. And I think Ted just took it to the grave with him. I thought he was going to maybe make a revelation, but...
Now, I got his book, the one that just came out.
Yes, sir.
Wrote, and I specifically looked up in that book what he said about the Warren Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of that methinks he protested too much sort of statement. Anyway, he went on for half a page about how he thought that was exactly what happened.
Really?
He perfectly agreed with the Warren Commission's conclusions.
You see, so that, again, there has to be something there, because that's just, it's not plausible. So he must have known something, and I think the truth, but there must be perhaps a national security issue based around that. He's still trying to protect that after all these years, and I don't know what it is. I guess we'll know.
It may still be that, whatever that Cuban thing was.
Could be.
Could be, something like that.
Could be. Very plausible. Very plausible. Are you going to the JFK Lancer Symposium this year?
Well, Ms. Conway, is that her
That's
name?
Correct. Deborah Conway, yes.
Yeah, she had asked me if I would speak this year, and I said, well, yeah, I will.
Wonderful.
So they've got me on from 4 to 5 Saturday of the meeting.
I was hoping to make it down there this year, but I'm not going to be able to. I was looking at the plane fare from Toronto, and it's in the thousands of dollars. So.
Well, I'll bet it is. Well, you've heard my story.
It's fantastic, and all of Canada now has heard your story. And I was wondering, sir, I ask everybody who comes on my show this, because of the demographic, a large number of the people that are listening to the show right now are university/college students, and a lot of them, as I had mentioned before, are studying to become doctors. I was wondering if you give a few words of inspiration, as I call it, for the students to continue their studies and go on and become doctors.
I've had a wonderful career as a doctor, and I think there's nothing else like it. Granted, other people in other professions may say the same about their professions, but it has distressed me somewhat to hear some of my colleagues at my age and younger say that because of all the problems with medicine now that they would not recommend that any of their children go into medicine. I think that's extremely short-sighted, and it's one of the most rewarding careers you can have. And I'm hoping that, while there are problems with medicine, that it's too important to let them not be solved in some appropriate way. And I'm pretty optimistic about, hopefully, we will come up with a suitable healthcare system that we're now working on in this country, and that it's still one of the greatest things, if not the greatest thing you can do, both for yourself and to serve other people.
And with that, sir, I want to thank you for serving all these years and saving so many lives. A fantastic humanitarian thing you've done all these years.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, sir. And I wish you nothing but the best in the future. Please do stay in touch, and if there's anything you ever want to discuss on air or off air, it would be only my pleasure to have you back on.
Well, I wish you well, and with your program and with yourself personally, and I hope everything goes very good for you.
Thank you. All the best to you and yours, sir. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Robert McClelland, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, he was the doctor who was working directly on JFK. When JFK was fatally wounded, he was brought to Trauma Room 1 in Parkland Hospital, and he was just relaying his story to us all evening. What an interview, and what a gentleman. Fine gentleman, very intelligent man, as I'm sure you've gathered by listening to that interview. Very astute. Certainly JFK had the best working on him, and certainly they gave it their all, there's no question.
You're listening to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. The time is now. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Next week, don't forget James Tague will be here. He has a riveting story, first-person witness. The week after that, Abraham Bolden, first African-American Secret Service agent on JFK's protective detail, handpicked by JFK himself, actually. www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. All the archives are there for you folks. This show will be up there shortly, probably within the next 2 or 3 days. Just download them for free, as I say all the time. If you're out there and you're looking for a volunteer gig, I could use some help, not only live in the studio, but if you're any good at editing and those types of things, send me an email. Email's there on the Night Fright website. Thank you all for listening. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you next time.